Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a question I think a lot of us have thought about, especially as parents. Are schools really preparing our kids for success, when it comes to money and the real world?
Yeah, it's a big one for sure.
It is. And to help us kind of unpack this, we're going to be looking at some excerpts from Robert Kiyosaki's book, Why A Students Work for C Students.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
Yeah, you might recognize Kiyosaki from his Rich Dad, Poor Dad series. He's definitely known for kind of shaking things up, challenging the traditional ways we think about education and money.
Right. Definitely not afraid to stir the pot a little bit.
Exactly. So get ready for some thought-provoking ideas as we dig into his arguments about the skills you need for entrepreneurship and wealth building and how this whole financial landscape is changing so rapidly.
Yeah, he starts off with this statistic that really caught my eye. 80% of Americans would rather own a business than be a Fortune 500 CEO. Think about that.
Wow, that's a pretty big number.
It is, right? It says a lot about what people truly desire.
For sure. It seems like there's this natural drive towards entrepreneurship, and then we have this go to school, get a good job message that's just ingrained in our culture.
Yeah, almost like a contradiction.
It really is.
And that's kind of Kiyosaki's point. He says traditional schools are great at producing employees, but they often miss the mark when it comes to teaching the practical skills needed to actually create jobs, manage money effectively, and build wealth,
Yeah, I think back to my own education, how much emphasis was placed on sales marketing, understanding financial statements.
Right. Were you out there analyzing businesses in high school?
Definitely not. It was more like, here's how to balance a checkbook.
That'll get you far.
Yeah, maybe not so much.
Enough.
It almost feels like we were taught to play the game without ever really understanding the rules.
Great analogy. And it's not about, bashing education. It's more about asking, is the system keeping up with the changing world? Are we giving our kids the tools they need not only to survive, but to thrive financially no matter what path they choose?
Yes. And speaking of paths, Kiyosaki makes this statement. A, students become academics, B, students become bureaucrats, and C, students become capitalists. Is he just trying to get attention here, or is there something deeper to this?
Well, I think there's definitely a bit of provocation there, but he's using those stereotypes to highlight something more fundamental, this idea of managerial capitalism. We're teaching kids to climb the corporate ladder, but not necessarily to build from the ground up.
Right. It's that difference between being an employee and an entrepreneur.
Exactly. True. Entrepreneurship is about innovation, taking risks, creating something new. And those skills aren't always nurtured in a traditional academic setting, are they?
Not really. And it's interesting because he brings in Dr. Frank Luntz, who argues that, maybe MBAs aren't all they're cracked up to be anymore because they focus so much on that corporate climb, not starting from scratch.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, is there a bias against entrepreneurship in our system?
It does. And I think as parents, that's a big question. Are we maybe overemphasizing traditional academic achievement and kind of unknowingly limiting our children's options? What if they have this incredible potential to be entrepreneurs, but they're never exposed to the skills, the mindset needed to thrive in that world?
Right. And it's hard to even know.
Yeah. And on top of that, Kiyosaki brings up these looming challenges. He calls them 800-pound gorillas. Things that he says aren't being talked about enough, but could have a massive impact on our children's future.
Oh, yeah, those gorillas.
So can you tell us more about them?
Absolutely. The first one he talks about is this rapidly changing job market. I mean, think about it with global competition, outsourcing, automation on the rise. What kind of jobs will even exist when your child enters the workforce? Will the skills they're learning today even be relevant in 10, 15 years?
They're a really good question.
It is. And that's just the first gorilla.
Yeah.
And it's scary to think about, right?
Absolutely. So what are some of the other gorillas Kiyosaki talks about?
Well, another big one is the growing national debt. He actually draws parallels to the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Whoa.
And how burdensome debt can be for future generations.
It's pretty unsettling when you put it like that.
It is, right? It makes you think, what kind of financial world are we leaving for our kids,
Yeah, it's a big question.
It is, and it's not just the debt itself, but the consequences. Kiyosaki argues that as governments try to manage this growing debt, they increase taxes, and that can stifle entrepreneurship and economic growth.
Yeah, it's like you're making it even harder to start a business.
Exactly. It becomes this vicious cycle.
Right. And then what's the last gorilla?
So the final one he discusses is retirement. The potential instability of traditional retirement systems, the idea that you work for 40 years, pay into a system, and then retire comfortably.
Right.
He questions whether that model will even be viable for our children. you know?
That's a scary thought.
It is a lot to consider, especially when you're trying to plan for their future.
So with all these gorillas on the horizon, what does Kiyosaki suggest we do? Like, how can we prepare our kids for all of this?
Well, this is where things get interesting. He sees financial education as the key, you know?
Okay.
He argues that traditional schools just don't equip students with the knowledge and skills they need to navigate these complex financial challenges, and it can leave them feeling lost or even entitled, you know?
It's true.
Instead of giving financial advice, he says we need to focus on building financial literacy.
I see what you mean. It's like that saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly. It's about empowerment, not handouts, you know?
Right.
And Kiyosaki actually shares this great story about a real estate course he took that completely shifted his mindset about debt. You know?
Oh, interesting.
He realized it's not about avoiding debt altogether. It's about understanding how to use it strategically to create assets and build wealth.
That's a good point. Do you have any personal experience with that, maybe with your home or investments?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I used to be terrified of debt, but then I learned that it can be a powerful tool if you know how to use it wisely. For example, I used a mortgage to buy my first rental property, and it's been a fantastic investment.
That's a perfect example. You know, it shows how financial education can empower you to make those smart decisions and build a secure future.
Exactly. And Kiyosaki takes this a step further with his concept of the cash flow quadrant. Have you heard of this before?
I have, but to be honest, it's a little fuzzy for me. Could you break it down?
Absolutely. It's basically a framework for understanding the different ways people generate income. You know, there are 4 quadrants: employees, self-employed, big business owners, and investors.
Okay.
Each one represents a different mindset and skill set, you know. So employees, they trade their time for money working for someone else.
Like the traditional 9 to 5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Self-employed individuals, they work for themselves, but they're still trading time for money. Think about your friend who opened that bakery we were talking about.
Oh, yeah.
She's her own boss, right? But she's still putting in those long hours. So then you have big business owners. They create systems, leverage other people's time and talents to generate income. You know, companies like Apple or Amazon.
The big players.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then investors, they make their money work for them through assets like real estate, stocks, businesses.
Okay, so it's all about where your income comes from.
Right. And the key takeaway is that financial education can help individuals move from relying solely on that ordinary income from a job to building portfolio income and passive income through investments and assets, you know?
So you're not just relying on one paycheck.
Exactly. It's about creating multiple streams of income.
That makes a lot of sense.
And, you know, Kiyosaki highlights that even people who come into large sums of money, lottery winners, professional athletes, they can end up broke if they don't understand how to manage, invest, and transform that income.
It's not just what you make, it's what you do with it.
Exactly. It makes you think, where do you see yourself within this cash flow quadrant? You know, what steps could you take to build a more secure financial future for yourself and your family?
It's definitely something to think about for sure. And, you know, speaking of empowering our kids, Kiyosaki outlines these 10 unfair advantages that parents can provide.
Oh, yeah. Those are great.
Can you talk about those a bit?
Absolutely. He has some really interesting ideas about how to give your child a leg up in the world, especially when it comes to finances. You know, one that really stands out, especially given our conversation about the job market, is mentorship. You know, Kiyosaki believes that working for free for a mentor can be more valuable than a paid job in some cases.
Wow, that's an interesting concept.
It is, right? What do you think about that?
I can definitely see how learning from someone with real-world experience could be invaluable.
Yeah.
You know, especially in today's rapidly evolving job market. It's like an apprenticeship for the 21st century.
I like that. And it connects back to the idea of financial education. It's not just about reading books or taking courses. It's about learning from someone who's already achieved the kind of success you aspire to.
Right. It's about seeing it in action.
Exactly. Another unfair advantage he talks about is this concept of retiring young.
Okay, don't tell me to quit my job.
Haha, no, not at all. But what Kiyosaki means by retiring young isn't necessarily about stopping work altogether. It's more about having the choice, you know, to work or not. It's about achieving financial freedom so that you're not tied to a job just to survive.
That's a really empowering way to think about it. You know, it's about having options and flexibility.
Exactly. And he believes that financial literacy is the key to unlocking that freedom. You know, he also emphasizes using the law of compensation to your advantage.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one.
So essentially, it means that the more experience and knowledge you gain, the more valuable you become and the more you can potentially earn. So it's about encouraging kids to be lifelong learners, to take risks, to develop those skills in areas that really interest them.
Yeah, it's about fostering that growth mindset, helping them understand that the more value they bring to the world, the more they can potentially be rewarded.
That's a great way to put it. And these are just a few of the unfair advantages Kiyosaki outlines in the book. Right? He goes into a lot more detail. Definitely recommend checking it out.
We'll have to link to that in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Okay, so before we move on, there's one more concept from the book that I wanted to unpack. It's maybe Kiyosaki's most controversial idea, but it's definitely thought-provoking. He talks about this idea of being the Fed.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
So what does he mean by that? Is he suggesting we all start printing our own money?
Not exactly. It's more about understanding the different forms of money and how they work. Kiyosaki breaks down money into these 4 categories: commodity money, reserve money, fractional reserve money, and fiat money.
Okay, I'm following so far.
And he argues that understanding how these different forms of money function can really shift your whole financial perspective. And he uses his own experience building a business that, quote unquote, prints money and investing in real estate to illustrate this idea of creating wealth independent of traditional jobs and investments.
But kind of creating your own system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He even talks about achieving an infinite return.
Infinite return that sound almost too good to be true.
I understand the skepticism. It's important to note that Kiyosaki's approach isn't for everyone. It requires careful, steady risk management and a willingness to challenge that conventional financial thinking,
Right. It's definitely not a get-rich-quick scheme.
No, not at all. But the underlying principle is really interesting. Can individuals create systems that generate wealth outside of those traditional avenues? It's a question worth exploring further.
Yeah, it really is. And, another thing that stood out to me from the book was Kiyosaki's emphasis on the power of language.
Oh, yeah.
He says that the words we use can shape our reality, especially when it comes to money.
It's so true. It all ties back to mindset. Kiyosaki contrasts the language of people who are struggling financially. They say things like, I can't afford that, with the language of the wealthy who tend to ask, how can I afford that?
Right. It's a subtle shift.
Yeah. Huge difference.
That makes a big difference. It reminds me of that Henry Ford quote, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
I love that one.
It's all about believing in your ability to find solutions.
Absolutely. And Kiyosaki actually takes this a step further. He emphasizes that, true wealth building isn't just about the technical stuff. It's also about what he calls spiritual education.
Okay, interesting.
It's about aligning your financial actions with your values and your purpose. It's not just about getting rich, but about living a rich life.
That's a really powerful concept.
It is.
And it makes me think about how we can instill those values in our kids.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about teaching them how to make money, but helping them understand the why behind it.
Absolutely. It's about empowering them to use their financial resources to make a positive impact on the world, whatever that looks like for them.
So looking back on everything we've discussed, it seems like Kiyosaki's main message is that traditional education may be falling short in preparing our kids for the financial realities of today's world.
Yeah, that's a great summary. He definitely makes a strong case for the importance of financial literacy, not just for accumulating wealth, but for having choices, security, and freedom in an uncertain future.
And I think he leaves us with this really powerful question to consider: if you could create your own currency, what would you build or create in the world?
It's a good one.
It really challenges you to think outside the box, tap into that entrepreneurial potential.
It is a call to action to move beyond limitations, recognize that we all have the power to shape our financial destinies and create a life of abundance and purpose.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about these concepts, we highly recommend checking out Why A Students Work for C-Students by Robert Kiyosaki. It's full of thought-provoking ideas and strategies for building a more secure and fulfilling financial future. Thanks for listening.